What if the only thing standing between life and death was the bark of a dog? It was past midnight when Officer David Walker and his loyal K-9, Rocky, patrolled the rain-soaked streets. David had chosen the night shift for a reason. After failing to save a child in a recent case, he preferred the silence of darkness to the judgment of people. But this night was different. Rocky froze. His ears shot up. His body stiffened. And then came the bark, deep, desperate, echoing through the abandoned barn. Most would ignore it. Just a dog barking at shadows. But what if that sound was the only clue to dozens of children trapped beneath the floorboards? Would you trust the dog or walk away? What David discovered next will break your heart and restore your faith in loyalty, courage, and second chances. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below. The rain had not yet become a storm, but it lingered in the air like a warning, thin threads of drizzle weaving through the dim glow of the street lamps. The small town of Pine Ridge lay quiet under the early hours, its sidewalks slick, its store windows dark. Only the low hum of a police cruiser broke the silence, crawling through streets that seemed to belong more to shadows than to people. Behind the wheel sat David Walker, a man whose broad shoulders looked like they had been carrying weight far heavier than the Kevlar vest strapped to his chest. At 47, his once sharp jawline bore the faint sag of exhaustion, and the peppered stubble along his chin only deepened the rugged lines carved by years of duty. His eyes were pale blue, striking in their clarity, yet dulled by a sorrow that had not left him since that night, the night he hadn't been fast enough. David had served Pine Ridge for over 2 decades. Known once for his steady nerves and his ability to calm even the most volatile suspects, he had become something of a ghost among his colleagues after the case that had broken him. A little girl, no more than 8, had slipped through his grasp. He had held her hand in those final moments, begging her to hold on as paramedics fought to save her. But she hadn't made it, and neither had the man he used to be. Since then, he had volunteered for every night shift that no one else wanted, choosing the company of rain and silence over the pitying eyes of townsfolk who still whispered, "He's the one who couldn't save her." Beside him sat Rocky, a German shepherd of 6 years, his sable coat gleaming faintly in the glow of the dashboard lights. Rocky was not just a dog. He was an officer in his own right, trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, and criminal apprehension. His ears were tall and sharp, twitching at every sound outside, his amber eyes alive with vigilance. To others, Rocky was impressive, disciplined, a model K-9. To David, he was more than that. He was the last partner who had not turned away, the one soul who did not judge him for a single night's failure. Rocky shifted slightly in the passenger seat, his muscular frame still yet alert. He gave a low, almost imperceptible whine, as if sensing his handler's thoughts. David glanced at him and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Don't start reading my mind, boy," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he knew Rocky already did, perhaps better than any human ever could. The streets of Pine Ridge were familiar, yet at night they transformed into something different, something lonelier. The diner on Main Street that bustled with chatter during the day was now a hollow shell, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The church at the corner stood with its steeple cutting into the wet sky, but its stained glass windows were black, no light from within. David drove slowly past these landmarks, his mind half in the present, half replaying. Flashes of the little girl's face. "You should have been faster. You should have done more." The guilt looped endlessly in his mind, as steady as the wipers sweeping across his windshield. Though he preferred solitude, he could not escape the murmurs of his colleagues. Deputy Mark Collins, a younger officer with a square jaw and the kind of confidence that comes with never having been truly tested, often called him the Ghost Rider. Collins was brash, quick to laugh, and quick to dismiss David's instincts as relics of an old man past his prime. David didn't hate him. He couldn't. But Collins' careless words dug deeper than the younger man realized. For David, every sideways glance from the department was a reminder that he was on borrowed respect. Rocky suddenly lifted his head, ears tilting forward. His body went rigid, eyes locking on the outline of an abandoned barn ahead. David felt the leash tighten slightly as Rocky shifted, muscles coiled like a spring. The barn sat at the edge of town, weather-beaten wood sagging, windows boarded, a place that had once belonged to the Whitaker family before they left for Arkansas years ago. Now, it was nothing but a hollow skeleton, the kind of place teenagers dared each other to sneak into. David slowed the cruiser, his gut stirring uneasily. Rocky gave a sharp bark, sudden and loud in the midnight stillness. It wasn't a bark of warning at a stray cat, nor the half-hearted growl he gave raccoons near the dumpsters. This was sharp, commanding, an alert bark. David's chest tightened. He knew the difference. Years of working with Rocky had taught him. When the dog barked like that, something was there. He reached for the radio clipped to his vest. "Unit 12 to dispatch," he said, his voice steady but low. "Possible situation at the Whitaker barn. K9 indicates unusual activity. Requesting backup." Static buzzed before a familiar voice crackled through. "Copy, Unit 12, but it's probably nothing, David. That place has been empty for years. You sure Rocky isn't just chasing ghosts?" It was Deputy Collins again, his tone dismissive, almost mocking. David clenched his jaw. He could picture Collins leaning back in his cruiser seat, smirking into the microphone. He swallowed the retort that rose to his lips. "He's not chasing ghosts," David answered curtly. "He's telling us something's wrong." But the radio fell silent after that. No immediate sign of anyone taking him seriously. For a moment, David sat in the driver's seat, the rain pattering harder against the windshield, the night pressing in. He could feel the old doubts gnawing at him. What if I'm wrong again? What if I force this and make myself look like a fool? The weight of his last failure pressed heavy on his chest. Then Rocky barked again, louder this time, pawing at the door, his breath fogging the window as he stared unblinking at the barn. His entire body screamed urgency. David looked at him, at the strength in those amber eyes, and felt something stir. Rocky wasn't wrong. He had never been wrong. With a sigh that was half resignation, half resolve, David switched off the cruiser's engine. "All right, boy," he whispered, reaching for the flashlight clipped to his belt. "If you say there's something in there, we're going in." Rocky wagged his tail once, brief but fierce, before jumping down from the seat as David opened the door. Together, man and dog stepped into the rain-slick night, their shadows stretching across the deserted field toward the barn that waited like a dark mouth, silent and watchful. David's heart pounded as he tightened his grip on the leash, every step closer to the barn, pulling him deeper into a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as Rocky pulled ahead, ears forward, determined, David knew there was no turning back. Whatever waited inside, this night would not let him walk away. Rain gathered in silver beads along the splintered ribs of the Whitaker barn, the downpour thickening until each gust of wind made the old boards creak like the hull of a tired ship. David Walker cut the cruiser's engine and stepped into mud that tried to claim the soles of his boots. Beside him, Rocky hit the ground in one clean, muscular leap, tail level, head high, ears locked forward. The dog's first bark shot into the dark like a flare. It wasn't noise. It was purpose given a voice. David felt the old instinct rise, measure the scene, control your breathing, listen to the dog. He understood Rocky's vocabulary almost as well as human speech, the clipped narcotics chirp, the throat-deep aggression meant to pin a suspect in place, the quiet huff that announced a harmless raccoon. This was none of those. This was the same hammering alarm Rocky had given on a winter night years ago when he dragged David by the sleeve toward a collapsed shed and a hypothermic old man. The memory burned like frostbite. David keyed his shoulder mic. "Unit 12 on site. Strong K9, alert at the Whitaker barn. Requesting backup for structure check." Static hissed. Then Deputy Collins came on, the young man's voice buoyant with the kind of certainty that belongs to people who haven't met their limit yet. "Copy 12. With all due respect, Walker, that place is dead as my pager in '09. Dog's probably chasing his own echo. We've got a noise complaint off Maple and a domestic brewing on 3rd. Don't make me leave real calls for a ghost barn." David pictured Collins leaning back in his seat, one forearm draped over the wheel, the glow of his dash lighting that perpetually amused mouth. He'd been described as good-looking in the town paper once, Square jaw, sandy hair, always a little too neat, after he'd broken a burglary ring. He liked to mention that story, didn't like to mention that the suspects were teens who never fought back. David swallowed the comment that wanted out. "Mark," he said evenly, "this isn't nothing." Rocky's on full alert. As if on cue, Rocky lunged to the barn's north wall and slammed both paws against the lowest boards, claws raking wood until fat splinters curled up like wet paper. He barked, paused, inhaled as if scenting through cracks, then barked again, faster, harsher. David crouched and pressed his palm to the boards. Cold air kissed the edges of his glove. Airflow space below. Not a graveyard of hay. A cavity. A new voice cut in. Sheriff Bill Harrison. The timbre of worn oak and gravel roads. "Walker, eyes on me. What do you have besides the bark?" David kept his hand on the plank. The cold seeped through to the bones. "I've got a temperature drop along the north wall and venting through the floorboards." The dog's focused, not scattered. "He's telling us to look down." There was a pause, long enough for rain to batter the mic and drum lightly on David's cap. "Understood," Harrison said. "Hold position. Do not enter alone. I'm en route from county line." ETA 15. Collins snorted back onto the channel. 15 minutes of Walker staring at a door in the rain. Riveting. "Hey, if you find Jimmy Hoffa under there, save me a tooth for evidence." David thumbed the radio down, not hard enough to break it, but with finality. He was too old for sparring and too tired for shame. The shame collected anyway. It always did. Like water under a bad roof. He saw the girl's hand again in his mind, small, gray-lipped, impossibly light, and felt the now familiar tightening in his chest that never quite crossed into a full panic attack. "You're here now," he told himself. "You're here on time. Don't miss what the dog is saying." Headlights swung across the field from the town road, then disappeared as the vehicle repositioned. Not the sheriff. The engine note was higher, fleetier. A door opened and closed, and a flashlight beam lanced the dark. Sergeant Linda Perez moved into view, her stride unhurried despite the rain. Perez was 40-something and built like a sprinter held together by wire, sinew, and a reservoir of patience she allocated carefully. She wore her black hair in a no-nonsense bun beneath a department cap. Afghan service left her with the habit of checking corners even in open country. She did it now, sweeping the beam along the barn's eaves, the puddled ruts, the hedgerow beyond. Her olive skin glistened with the wet, and her expression carried the blunt inquiry of someone who would believe you but also make you prove it. "Dispatch flagged your call," she said, voice low to keep from spooking the dog. "I was closer than Harrison. Collins can pound sand." She looked at Rocky, took his measure, then David's. "What's the picture?" "Cold air through the planks," David said. "No odors I can pick up, but he's locked on the subfloor." "He won't give it up." Perez hunkered beside Rocky. He flicked one ear at her, then ignored her for the floor. She laid a hand flat on the wood. "He's not performing. He's working." There was still a narrowing to her eyes, a half step between observation and faith. "Could be a crawl space," she added, "or just a busted beam." At that, Rocky's bark changed, shorter bursts stacked almost without breath, the sound punching the ribs. Perez's skepticism thinned visibly, like fog under a heating lamp. She slid her hand along the seam where two planks met. When she lifted it, a hair-thin draft darkened the wet on her knuckles. "Okay," she said quietly. "Something's venting." She looked to David. "You smell anything?" "Just wet wood and varnish ghosts." "Your dog smells something else," she said, and the final shell of doubt left her tone. David levered the maglite beam against the plank edges and followed the hairline along the wall. The barn itself told a story. Nail heads in irregular patterns, a sag that suggested ad hoc repair, and toward the north quarter, a run of newer screws sunk with a bit, not hammered, their heads only lightly rusted. Someone had been under here in the last year, maybe less. Rain hammered harder, thunder shuffled somewhere behind the hills. Collins reappeared on the channel, tinny and impatient. "Walker, status. You two married to that wall yet?" David didn't answer. Perez toggled her mic instead. "Unit 7 on scene. We have probable subfloor void with airflow. Request you reroute from Maple. If the officer on third can stabilize, divert him as well, and tell him to bring a bar and a thermal cam if he's got one. Sergeant, Collins said, tone edging towards sulky, you're not seriously taking this bedtime story. Reroute, deputy, Perez said, steel sliding into velvet. If there's nothing here, you can write me up for believing in dogs. She let the line go dead. Then to David, lower. Buy us time. Keep your boy on task. Don't lift a single board until we have cover and a lens. If it's just a void, we get embarrassed and go home. If it's not... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Rocky shifted tactics as if he understood the plan. Instead of tearing at one point, he began tracing a rectangle with his nose, pacing nose down, circling back, tapping his paw at the corners. David watched the pattern resolve. He's mapping edges, he murmured, half to himself, half to the dog in praise. Good boy. Show it. The rectangle was about 6 by 8 feet, tight to the wall, too symmetrical to be accident. Perez angled her light for a bleak glare. Beneath a sheen of dirty rainwater, the faintest grid became visible where the boards had been cut and reseated. Someone had made a hatch here and disguised it well. Well enough to trick casual eyes, not a working K9. Perez inhaled and slow exhaled, resetting her pulse. If we open it without tools, we'll splinter half the structure, she said. We wait for Harrison. Copy, David said, though every muscle in his body tugged toward the boards. Rocky, as if sensing the leash of command on his handler, eased back to a sit, but his hackles were lightly raised and he kept a continuous low whine in his throat that vibrated through the floor. It wasn't fear. It was urgency disciplining itself. Across the muddy field, a semi-feral cat ghosted out from the brush, long and gray with burrs tangled in its tail. It froze at the edge of the barn light, pupils blown wide, then vanished under the tool shed. Rocky didn't so much as flick an ear for it. David filed that away, reassured. When a dog that would normally clock every small animal refused to break focus, the signal wasn't just strong, it was screaming. He looked at Perez. You ever notice how the air tastes different when it's wrong? Perez rolled a shoulder in silent agreement. Soldiers understood each other in unflashy increments. I've felt it, she said. Right before doors blew, right before not doors blew. She checked the perimeter again with her light and added, we keep sight lines. No hero stuff. No hero stuff, David echoed, though the word hero always sat wrong in his mouth. On the night that mattered, he hadn't been one. The radio clicked alive, another unit acknowledging reroute, then the sheriff again, calm as a metronome. I'm 2 miles out. Collins is 3 behind me like a teenager late to Sunday service. Walker, Perez, you hold. If that hatch is hot, we do it by the book. Copy, Sheriff, Perez said. David leaned against the wall to ease the ache that had crept into his lower back in the cold. He glanced down at Rocky. The dog looked back, unblinking, a bead of rain trembling at the tip of one black-tipped ear. We're not walking away, David told him. The dog's chest rose and fell, slowed a fraction at the voice. Then he turned back to the hatch and set his paw lightly, deliberately, on the edge he had mapped, as if taking an oath on wood and water. Lightning stitched a ragged seam somewhere over the ridge. For a heartbeat, the field lit up bone white, and in that flash the barn seemed less like a ruin and more like a mouth sealed shut by carpenters who didn't want anyone to know it could still swallow. The dark returned even thicker, a sound-muffling velvet, broken only by the rain and Rocky's disciplined whine. David felt the now familiar split screen inside himself, the cautious professional who knew protocols by muscle memory, and the man with a ledger of regret who could not bear to add one more line to the wrong column. He thought of the little girl's mother, the way she had tried to be brave at the hospital and failed, and he felt a heat climb his throat that the rain couldn't cool. Not again, he told himself. Not this time. Headlights knifed through the curtain of rain at the far fence line and swung toward them, slow and deliberate, throwing the barn's shadow long across the ground. Sheriff Harrison's SUV, grill guard shining wet, eased through the gap, and another unit's strobes flared a muted red-blue against the hedgerow as it followed. Rocky broke from the whine into 2 sharp barks, not alarm now, but summons. David straightened. Perez stepped forward to flag the approach. her flashlight raised just enough to mark position without killing anyone's night vision. The radio crackled with arrival codes and then quieted under Harrison's voice, close enough now to carry without electronics. "Nobody moves the wood until I say," he called through the rain, voice steady, iron behind it. "We do this right." David nodded once, felt Rocky's leash go tight again as the dog pressed his chest to the seam, and kept his own voice level. "We held," he said to no one and everyone. "We heard him." They had what they needed: the dog's insistence, airflow from below, the rectangle traced by a nose that didn't know how to lie. The decision was made without words. The night leaned in, listening. Rocky set his paw on the seam again and waited for the order that would turn Bark into action. Sheriff Bill Harrison's SUV idled outside, its headlights spilling pale beams across the rain-slick field. The man himself stepped out into the storm, raincoat snapping against his broad frame. At 60, Harrison looked every bit the veteran lawman, square jaw softened by age, silver stubble covering a chin that had delivered orders and prayers in equal measure. His eyes, a cool steel gray, scanned the barn with that blend of suspicion and gravity that only decades of service could etch into a man. He nodded once at David Walker, then bent to give Rocky a quick study, acknowledging the dog's unwavering focus without a word. Harrison's presence settled the chaos like sand in water. Perez gave a brief rundown, her voice firm but quick. David listened with half an ear, his mind caught between the barn's silence and the thunder muttering overhead. He could feel Rocky vibrating at his side, the leash taut with suppressed energy. The barn smelled of rot, wet hay, and something else, something that didn't belong. Harrison motioned to the second arriving unit, where Deputy Carl Jennings hauled a crowbar and thermal camera from the trunk. Jennings was a thick-set man in his early 50s, with a wide, weathered face and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and hardship in equal measure. His heavy mustache dripped rainwater as he handed off the crowbar, muttering in a gravelly baritone. Jennings had once worked construction before joining law enforcement late in life, after a layoff and a bitter divorce. That history gave him a knack for tools and an earthy patience, though he rarely smiled in the field. They crowded inside the barn, boots clomping on warped wood. Flashlights jittered across the interior, piles of rusted tools, collapsed bales, a tractor frame long surrendered to rot. Dust rose in the damp air, mixing with the sharpness of mildew. Rocky padded straight to the north wall, nose pressed low, barking with such precision it made Collins, now sulking in the corner, roll his eyes. "If we're chasing mice tunnels, we'll look mighty stupid on the morning report," Collins muttered. His sarcasm grated, but Harrison ignored it, fixing his gaze on David. "Show us." David knelt by the rectangle Rocky had traced. He pressed the maglite beam across the floor. Even through the veil of rain seeping through the roof, the cut lines showed, straight, deliberate, hidden under a scatter of straw. Harrison grunted, a low sound of grim recognition. Jennings crouched, set the thermal lens over the seam, and frowned. Cold pocket, distinct square. Airflow from beneath. He shook his head, water dripping from his mustache. "That ain't natural settling. Someone carved this." The decision passed without debate. Harrison set his jaw. "Pry it." Jennings slid the crowbar under the seam, wood groaning as nails shrieked against rust. The smell came first, a draft of air so damp and stale it seemed older than the barn itself. Rocky growled deep in his throat, then barked sharply, pulling toward the opening. The panel gave way with a splintering crack, revealing a rectangular hatch yawning into blackness. A cold breath rushed upward, carrying mildew, rust, and the faintest tang of earth long undisturbed. For David, the smell was a punch straight into memory, his vision blurred with the recollection of antiseptic corridors, the cry of monitors flatlining, and the tiny hand he had held as it grew limp. His throat tightened, his body freezing as the old wound tore open. Shadows gathered at the edges of his vision, pulling him backward toward the night he failed. He almost let go of the flashlight, almost stepped back. But then the leash in his grip went taut, Rocky tugging hard, eyes burning gold in the beam. The dog whined, not playful, not fearful, but insistent. It was as if Rocky was telling him, "You will not walk away. Not again." Perez steadied the flashlight, her voice low. "There's a ladder." She angled the beam. Rotten rungs descended into darkness, vanishing after 10 feet. The wood glistened with moisture, each rung swollen and cracked. "Looks barely alive," Jennings muttered. Collins snorted. "Nobody's going down there, right?" "Not until we get state support." Harrison's silence spoke volumes. He looked at David as though reading the man's turmoil like a file. "Walker," he said, calm but weighted. "You've got first call. You and the dog. You willing?" David's breath came shallow, heartbeat rattling his ribs. "Willing? Number." But the leash in his hand was alive with Rocky's certainty. He gave a single nod. "We're going." Harrison gave a sharp nod in return. Jennings muttered something about ropes, but moved aside. Perez's dark eyes lingered on David, unreadable but not unsympathetic. David knelt at the hatch, testing the first rung with his boot. It held with a groan. Rocky whined once, then leaned forward, ready. David whispered, "With me, boy," and stepped down. Each rung flexed, threatening to give way, but he held steady. Rocky pressed close, the dog's claws clicking lightly against the wood. The damp swallowed them, the beam of the maglight piercing only a fraction of the gloom. The air was heavy, clinging to the skin, carrying with it something fouler than mildew, something human and wrong. At the bottom, the ladder gave on to packed dirt, walls lined with rough planks. The space was narrow, no larger than a modest bedroom, with shadows massed in every corner. David swung the beam, throat tight. The room looked bare, abandoned, yet the air trembled with a sense of waiting. Behind him, Rocky growled, deep and low, his body rigid. David lifted the flashlight higher. The beam landed on a rusty chair bolted into the ground, straps hanging limp from its arms. The sight made his stomach twist. He raised the radio, but his thumb froze on the transmit button. The shadows of the past pressed down hard. Failure, guilt, the weight of every second too late. His knees nearly buckled. Then Rocky leaned against his leg, solid and warm, anchoring him to the present. The dog's presence spoke louder than words. "Do not retreat." David gritted his teeth, raised the flashlight higher, and prepared himself for what might come next. The air in the hidden chamber felt alive with dampness. Each breath David Walker drew tasting of rust and soil. His flashlight cut jagged beams through the gloom, bouncing off rough dirt walls and the single iron chair bolted to the ground. Rocky stood stiff beside him, nose twitching, hackles raised, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. David steadied the beam, pushing deeper into the shadows. A soft shuffle came from the far corner. He froze. The light landed on a small figure, huddled against the wall, knees drawn to chest. It was a child, no older than 9, with tangled blonde hair falling in greasy strands over a pale, dirt-streaked face. Wide blue eyes blinked against the sudden brightness. The girl's arms were so thin they looked like twigs, her oversized shirt torn and caked with grime. She flinched when the beam touched her, whispering a wordless plea. Then the beam revealed more. Another child crouched beside her, this one a boy, maybe 11, wiry and sharp-featured with dark skin and close-cropped black hair. His clothes hung loose as if they belonged to someone else, and his eyes carried a guarded fire, suspicious yet desperate. Behind him, in the shadows, 3 more small forms pressed together, their breathing shallow, their faces white with fear. David's chest tightened. He dropped to one knee, lowering the flashlight so its glare softened. Rocky, sensing the shift, silenced his growl and sat slowly, ears tilting forward. His gaze softened, amber eyes glowing with quiet patience. The children stared at him, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The blonde girl whispered hoarsely, her voice thin but clear. The dog heard us." David felt his throat constrict. For months he had lived under the weight of a little girl he hadn't saved, her last moments replaying in endless torment. And now, before him, were 5 children who still breathed, whose trembling lives hung by a thread, and whose hope had been reignited not by him, but by the bark of his dog. Behind him, Sergeant Linda Perez lowered herself carefully from the ladder, flashlight steady, her wiry frame moving with precision. Rainwater clung to her olive skin, dripping from the hem of her jacket. She froze at the sight, her eyes narrowing in shock, then softening with an ache only veterans know, the ache of seeing innocence brutalized. "Dear God," she whispered, voice low and sharp. Moments later, Deputy Carl Jennings descended, his heavier frame making the latter groan. He steadied himself, mustache dripping, and drew a long breath through his nose. His lined face hardened, every crease deepening with anger. "Kids," he muttered, voice rough with disbelief. "Who would—" He cut himself off, jaw clenching. Jennings, a father estranged from his own grown son, carried that private wound like an open scar. He had missed birthdays, graduations, too stubborn to mend fences. Now, faced with children discarded like trash, his regret boiled into fury. Collins remained above, muttering complaints, until Harrison ordered him down. The sheriff descended last, careful and deliberate. His steel-gray eyes swept the chamber, fixing on each frightened face. The children shrank back, whimpers rising like the rustle of dry leaves. Harrison's lined features, carved by decades of carrying other people's burdens, shifted with something rare, visible grief. David holstered his flashlight and slowly unhooked Rocky's leash, trusting the dog. Rocky padded forward, his movements slow, deliberate, his head lowered in peace. He sat just within reach of the children and waited. One by one, their wide eyes fixed on him, watching. Finally, the wiry boy extended a trembling hand, his suspicion cracking. Rocky leaned in, pressing his warm nose gently into the boy's palm. The boy's lips quivered. A choked sob escaped, but his shoulders eased. The others followed, inching closer, drawn by Rocky's steady calm. Perez crouched, her voice low but certain. "We need blankets, medics, food, now." Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the radio clipped to her vest. Jennings moved closer to the children, but stopped short, his rough voice trembling. "It's okay now. You're safe. We're here." His words, simple and awkward, carried the weight of sincerity. David knelt beside Rocky, his large hands trembling as he set the flashlight on the ground. He looked into the children's eyes, so fragile, yet burning with the will to live. He swallowed hard, every nerve in his body screaming at the memory of that one child he had lost. He had begged for another chance, though he never said it aloud. And now, it was as if heaven itself had opened this door. He whispered, voice thick, "This is your moment. Don't fail them." Rocky pressed his head against David's knee as if affirming the vow. The blonde girl, her eyes glassy with tears, leaned into Rocky's fur and whispered again, "The dog saved us." David bowed his head, the weight in his chest shifting from guilt to something sharper, stronger. This wasn't redemption yet, but it was a chance. He looked up, meeting Harrison's gaze. The sheriff gave a single, heavy nod, a wordless acknowledgement of both the horror and the miracle they had stumbled upon. In the stale, suffocating dark, surrounded by trembling children and his steadfast dog, David Walker felt, for the first time in months, that perhaps God had not abandoned him after all. Morning crept into Pine Ridge with a pale, reluctant light, rain clouds breaking into ragged patches of gray. The night in the barn had left its mark on everyone. David Walker sat on the cruiser's hood, jacket damp, his face hollowed by exhaustion. The 5 children were wrapped in blankets, their fragile forms ferried to ambulances under Sheriff Harrison's watchful eye. Rocky sat by David's side, silent but alert, as if guarding his handler's thoughts as much as the survivors. By dawn, the barn was swarming with county investigators, evidence techs moving like shadows with cameras and kits. The air hummed with questions, each one heavier than the last. Who had locked those children underground, and why? Harrison's orders were clipped and stern, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew their town had been broken open. "Every lead, every angle," he growled, gray eyes scanning the scene. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Detective Sarah McKenna arrived from the county seat just after sunrise. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, her auburn hair tied into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Her pale skin made the freckles across her nose more pronounced, giving her an unexpectedly youthful look despite the severity in her expression. She was known in the department for her relentlessness, The kind of investigator who would sift through ash with her bare hands if it meant finding a clue. Trauma shaped her, too. Her brother had vanished as a teenager, never found. It left her with an unshakable need to expose hidden truths, a determination etched into the hard set of her jaw. She took one look at the barn and muttered, "Somebody trusted the wrong man with too much." At the sheriff's briefing, names surfaced. Maintenance workers, drifters, old family feuds. But it was a file pulled from one of the children's whispered statements that froze the room. The wiry boy, still trembling but coherent, had said through cracked lips, "The man smelled like medicine." Like the doctor's office, silence settled heavy. There was only one doctor in Pine Ridge, Dr. Alan Carter, mid-50s, tall and spare, his once black hair streaked with dignified silver. He wore glasses with thin gold frames and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew people respected him. He had been the town's physician for decades, delivering babies, stitching wounds, comforting the sick. His reputation was immaculate, built on bedside warmth and steady hands. He lived in a modest but well-kept Victorian house near the square, where his clinic stood on the first floor. David felt the name hit like a hammer. His late wife, Anna, had spent months under Carter's care during her illness. Carter had been kind then, gentle, offering reassurance when David was drowning in helplessness. That trust had been bone deep. Now, to hear whispers tying him to this horror, it turned David's stomach to acid. His hands clenched, until his knuckles went white. Harrison's voice cut through the tension. "We don't throw accusations without evidence, but we don't ignore testimony either. Walker, Perez, you and Rocky run a scent check on Carter's property. Quiet. I don't want half the county spooking him before we know what we've got." The clinic smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish, the air clean, almost too clean. Posters about childhood vaccinations and healthy diets lined the walls, cheerful but suddenly sinister in their brightness. Carter's receptionist, Martha Doyle, a stout woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and graying curls, greeted them nervously. She had worked for Carter for years, trusted him implicitly. Her floral blouse was wrinkled, and she kept smoothing it as if to cover her unease. "Dr. Carter isn't in yet," she said, her voice uncertain. "He left early last night. Emergency call. I think Harrison had arranged for her to be interviewed separately, but for now, she lingered in the waiting room, bewildered by the police presence." David unclipped Rocky's leash. "Search," he commanded softly. The German shepherd's nose went to work, sweeping along the baseboards, across the counters, around the examination tables. His claws clicked on linoleum, his breathing steady and deliberate. Perez followed close, jotting notes, her dark eyes sharp. Rocky paused at a door marked "Storage, Staff Only." His ears shot forward, body stiffening. He whined, pawed once at the seam, then looked back at David, amber eyes hard with certainty. David felt his pulse hammer. He glanced at Perez, who nodded grimly. "He's on it." Jennings arrived moments later, lugging a toolkit. He made quick work of the lock, the crowbar levering it open with a squeal of metal. The smell that rushed out wasn't cleaning solution. It was earth. Damp, stale earth. The same scent that had risen from the barn's hidden hatch. Inside the room, shelves lined with bandages and medicine bottles concealed a false wall, its seams visible only under close scrutiny. Rocky pressed his nose to the crack, tail rigid, then let out a low, guttural bark. Perez exhaled sharply. "That's probable cause." Behind the false wall was a narrow chamber, hidden by clever carpentry. The air was thick, laced with mildew, and something metallic. Evidence technicians moved in with cameras, and their flashes lit up horrors, child-size restraints, boxes of sedatives, files marked with initials. David's gut twisted as he recognized handwriting he had once trusted, Alan Carter's looping script. A storm of emotions crashed over him, rage, betrayal, grief. He could see his wife lying in one of Carter's clinic beds, could hear the doctor's voice telling him to rest, to trust. The bile rose sharp in his throat. He staggered back, bracing himself against the wall, breath ragged. Rocky pressed close to his leg, grounding him. Sheriff Harrison's face hardened, like stone. He had known Carter for 30 years. had eaten Sunday dinner with the man's family, had attended church services with him. Now, the betrayal carved fresh lines into his weathered features. "Get a warrant," he ordered, voice steel. "Seal this place. We bring him in." Outside, the townspeople still walked with trust in their doctor, oblivious to the truth unraveling within those clean clinic walls. For David, the shattering realization was more than professional. It was personal, a knife twisting in a wound that had never healed. And as Rocky's steady presence anchored him, David knew the fight had only begun. The sky over Pine Ridge split with thunder, as if the heavens themselves were tearing open. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, but by nightfall it came with full fury. Sheets of rain slashing sideways, winds bending the tree line, lightning turning the landscape into jagged fragments of light and shadow. The courthouse warrant had been signed by dusk, and Sheriff Bill Harrison gathered his team outside Dr. Alan Carter's Victorian home. Officers in slick rain ponchos moved with weapons ready, boots squelching in mud, radios crackling in the storm's static. David Walker stood at the front, Rocky pressed against his leg, the dog's coat gleaming wet, amber eyes locked forward with the unblinking intensity of a soldier. David's own pulse thudded heavy. His mind was a swirl of dread and betrayal. He remembered Carter's calm voice telling him to rest easy during his wife's final weeks. Remembered the false comfort of a man he now knew to be a monster. Detective Sarah McKenna, soaked through her black trench coat, gave a nod from her position across the yard. Her auburn hair clung to her pale face, freckles stark under the wet, her eyes sharp with a personal hunger for justice. She had taken the lead in preparing the case, her file thick with Carter's handwriting and damning evidence. Now she carried her Glock with steady hands, a woman unwilling to blink in the face of betrayal. When Harrison ordered the breach, the team surged forward, but Carter was not inside. The back door slammed against its hinges, footprints already washing in the rain. He had fled, leaving the house empty of warmth and full of shadows. "Into the woods!" Harrison barked, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. The searchlight swung and caught Carter's tall figure darting into the tree line. His soaked white shirt clung to his gaunt frame, silver hair plastered to his head. Even in desperation, he moved with surprising speed, like a cornered animal fueled by terror and calculation. His glasses were gone, his face twisted with something raw, a mask stripped away. David and Rocky sprinted after him, mud sucking at their boots and paws. Rain blinded, branches clawed, the ground churned into a battlefield of roots and water. Each flash of lightning revealed Carter ahead, stumbling but not falling, clutching something metallic in his hand. Rocky surged forward, muscles straining, his bark slicing through thunder. David's lungs burned, his legs aching, but he pressed on, his focus sharpened by rage and resolve. Suddenly Carter turned, his frame lit by a lightning flash, a pistol raised. His voice cracked against the storm. "Stay back, David. I saved your wife more pain than you ever could. Don't make me put you down, too." The words hit harder than the thunder. David faltered, his heart twisting with old grief. For a moment, his trigger finger hesitated. Carter's silhouette was more than a fugitive. It was the man who once held Anna's hand, who had spoken softly in her worst hours. Doubt rattled his bones. But Rocky didn't doubt. With a guttural snarl, the German shepherd launched himself forward. Time slowed. Carter's hand tightened on the trigger. David shouted. The wind howled. Rocky hit Carter square in the chest, jaws snapping at the pistol arm, driving him into the mud. The gun fired once, the bullet whining harmlessly into the trees. They fell in a heap, Carter cursing. Rocky's growl a steady thunder beneath the storm. David rushed forward, ripping the weapon free, his boot pinning Carter's wrist. Mud and rain smeared across Carter's once pristine face. His silver hair matted, his eyes no longer kind, but feral, exposed. Sheriff Harrison and Jennings arrived seconds later, weapons raised but unnecessary. Harrison's lined face was grim as he hauled Carter upright. "Alan Carter," he said, his voice like iron striking an anvil. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and the betrayal of every soul in this town." Carter spat rainwater, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "They trusted me because you were too blind to see. All of you, David stood over him, chest heaving, Rocky pressed close, the dog's fur bristling but his eyes calm now, victory in his posture. David's hand trembled on his holstered weapon, not from fear, but from the war raging inside, rage, grief, betrayal. He thought of Anna, of the trust he had given this man, and for a moment he wanted nothing more than to silence him forever. But he didn't. He looked at Rocky, who stood steady and resolute, reminding him of duty, of second chances, of the line between justice and vengeance. David stepped back, his voice hoarse. "Take him alive! Let the truth be seen." The storm raged on, but in that moment it seemed quieter. The mask of Doctor, Alan Carter, the healer, the man of trust, was gone, replaced by mud, fear, and the weight of his crimes. And David Walker, soaked to the bone, knew that Rocky had not only saved his life, but also pulled him back from the edge of his own darkness. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Pine Ridge washed clean, but heavy with silence. The hospital sat on the edge of town, its brick walls damp from the night's rains, its windows glowing with the first light of dawn. Ambulances lined the curb, their flashing lights muted against the pale sky. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and coffee, the quiet broken only by the shuffle of nurses and the distant beep of monitors. David Walker moved slowly through the corridor, the weight of exhaustion pressing against his shoulders. His boots still carried the mud of last night's chase, and his uniform clung stiff with dried rain. Yet none of it mattered as much as the sight of the children. They were scattered in separate rooms, their frail bodies swaddled in clean sheets, IV lines whispering into their veins. Nurses moved softly around them, whispering instructions, adjusting drips, their faces pale with sympathy. Rocky padded beside David, his coat brushed clean, but still damp in places. The proud set of his ears softened by the environment. The German shepherd moved without command, as though he understood his presence was needed. He nosed into each room, his amber eyes scanning the children, his breath warm and steady. Where he stopped, fear seemed to ebb away. In one room, the blonde girl lay curled on her side, trembling even in sleep. When Rocky entered, she stirred, eyes opening wide in alarm. But instead of barking, he lay down slowly on the linoleum, his head on his paws. After a long pause, the girl stretched a tentative hand from beneath the blanket, her fingers brushing his fur. Her breathing slowed. Within minutes, her eyelids fluttered shut, and she slipped into the first unbroken sleep she had known in weeks. A few doors down, the wiry boy sat upright, knees hugged to his chest, refusing to let the nurses near. His dark eyes darted with suspicion, every movement a potential threat. David leaned against the doorway, unsure how to bridge the gap. Rocky, however, walked straight in, sat a few feet away, and tilted his head. The boy stared at him, chest heaving. Finally, Rocky shifted closer, inch by inch, until his nose was pressed against the boy's leg. A shaky breath escaped the boy, his posture loosening. He reached out, fingers tangling in Rocky's thick coat. Tears fell, soundless but steady. Word of the rescue had already spread. Reporters clustered outside the hospital doors, their umbrellas bobbing as they tried to catch a glimpse. In the waiting area, Detective Sarah McKenna flipped through her notes, auburn hair damp, freckles stark under fatigue. Her pale green eyes flicked to David as he passed, and she offered a nod, her posture still taut, but her expression soft. She had carried her own scars into this case, but watching Rocky work seemed to ease something in her too. "They trust him more than us," she murmured. David nodded, voice low. "Because he doesn't ask for anything. He just gives sheriff." Harrison arrived later, dressed in civilian clothes, his steel-gray eyes shadowed by lack of sleep. At his side was Dr. Ellen Whitmore, the hospital's pediatrician. She was in her early 40s, tall with a runner's build, her dark brown hair tied back in a loose braid. Her skin was warm-toned, her expression kind but edged with discipline. She had spent her career treating children through fevers and accidents, and it showed in the calm certainty of her movements. Yet even she seemed shaken by the state of the rescued kids. "They'll survive," she told Harrison, "but trust will take longer." Her voice was soft, but the weight behind it was undeniable. David stayed close to Rocky as the dog settled in each room. The children who had arrived trembling and mute began to relax, some leaning into his fur, others clinging to his tail as though it were a lifeline. Nurses began to whisper about him in the halls, their tired smiles brightened by the sight of hope returning to small faces. When the press conference came that afternoon, Sheriff Harrison stood at the podium, raincoat draped over his arm. Cameras flashed, pens scratched, and microphones tilted toward him. He praised his team, the investigation, the coordination that led to Carter's capture. But when the reporters pressed, asking who the real hero was, Harrison's eyes softened. He glanced at David, then at the German shepherd sitting tall at his side. "We all did our jobs," he said, his gravelly voice steady. "But let me be clear. If it wasn't for Rocky, we wouldn't have found those children in time." David shifted uncomfortably as the cameras turned toward him. He cleared his throat, stepping forward just enough for his voice to carry. His face was haggard, his blue eyes shadowed but steadier than before. "I wore the badge, I carried the radio, but last night, it wasn't me. Rocky's the one who never gave up. He's the hero." The flashbulbs caught the tremor in his expression, the relief mingled with sorrow. Perez, standing off to the side, crossed her arms, her sharp eyes glinting with a rare smile. Jennings, mustache twitching, gave a slow nod, pride visible even through fatigue. And Sarah McKenna, pen poised, wrote down David's words, her lips curving faintly as if she knew those lines would echo far beyond the courthouse walls. That night, when the crowd dispersed and the children slept, David sat in the quiet hospital corridor, Rocky's head resting against his knee. For the first time in months, the crushing guilt inside him had shifted. The face of the child he had failed still lingered, but alongside it now stood the faces of the children saved. He whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, boy. You gave me back a reason to wear this badge." Rocky wagged his tail once, slow and certain, as though to say, "We go on together." The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of hearings, paperwork, and long nights at the station. Yet in all of it, David Walker found his world quietly shifting. The children were placed in protective care, but one boy, in particular, lingered in his thoughts. Tommy Harper, a thin 10-year-old with tousled brown hair and solemn gray eyes that seemed too old for his face. He had been the quietest of the rescued children, speaking only in short bursts, but when he did, his words carried weight. His parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving him shuttled between foster homes. In Carter's prison, Tommy had been the one who whispered encouragement to the others, urging them to hold on. That resilience struck David like an echo of his own younger self, wounded, but still searching for something worth trusting. Rocky had chosen him first. In the hospital, the German shepherd curled up at the foot of Tommy's bed and refused to leave. Nurses noted how Tommy's restless nights eased when Rocky pressed against him, the boy's hands gripping the dog's fur until dreams loosened their grip. David would stand in the doorway, watching the boy and the dog, feeling something stir inside him that he had thought long dead. It was Sheriff Harrison who voiced what David had already begun to feel. "That kid looks to you, Walker," the older man said one evening, his steel-gray eyes soft for once. "Might be time you stopped punishing yourself and gave someone a reason to look forward again." Harrison's lined face carried a rare gentleness then, the kind born of a man who had lost more friends than he could count and learned that healing sometimes came in unexpected forms. The process was slow, meetings with social services, home checks, court approvals, but eventually Tommy stood beside David in the courthouse, his small hand gripping Rocky's leash, as a judge signed the adoption papers. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Bell, with cropped silver hair and sharp glasses, had seen her share of troubled families. Yet she smiled warmly as she declared David the boy's guardian. "A house is made of walls," she said quietly, "but a home is made of trust. This boy deserves one, and so do you." Life changed in small but steady ways. David's modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of Pine Ridge took on new sounds. The scrape of small sneakers across the porch, the thud of a backpack dropped by the door, the laughter of a child breaking through the once oppressive silence. Rocky became the guardian of this fragile new beginning. At night, when Tommy's nightmares came, visions of locked doors and whispered threats, Rocky would leap onto the bed, settle beside him, and hold vigil until the boy's breathing steadied. David, listening from the hallway, felt his own scars soften in the quiet of those moments. Detective Sarah McKenna visited one weekend, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she leaned on the porch rail. She watched Tommy throw a stick across the yard, Rocky bounding after it with unbridled joy. "You look different, Walker," she said, her pale green eyes narrowing in thoughtful amusement. "Less like a man carrying ghosts, more like one learning to live again." David chuckled, the sound rusty but real. "Guess the dog decided it was time I had a family again." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, her freckles brightening as she replied, "Or maybe the family decided you were worth saving." Perez stopped by with groceries once, her wiry frame softened by an awkward smile as she handed Tommy a bag of candy. Jennings came another time, his heavy mustache twitching as he built a birdhouse with the boy in the yard, muttering about how a good roof should last longer than I did in my marriage. Even Harrison appeared one Sunday, bringing fishing rods and telling Tommy in his gravelly voice, "Every man should know how to catch his supper." Slowly, the circle of colleagues that had once felt like distant co-workers began to form the outlines of something like a community around David and his new son. But it was Rocky who remained the center of it all. He was the unspoken anchor, the silent sentinel, the bridge between a man and a boy who both needed healing. One golden evening, months later, David drove Tommy and Rocky to the lake outside town. The water stretched calm, reflecting the sky as the sun sank low, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. They sat side by side on the old wooden dock, David steady with his fishing pole, Tommy swinging his legs just above the ripples, Rocky lying between them, ears flicking at every bird call. For a long while, none of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Tommy leaned against David's arm and whispered, "This feels like home." David's throat tightened, but he didn't look away from the horizon. He placed his hand gently on Tommy's shoulder and nodded. Rocky lifted his head, tail thumping once against the boards, as if sealing the promise. The sun slipped lower, shadows lengthening, 3 silhouettes against the water. Man, boy, and dog, bound not by blood, but by loyalty, trust, and the grace of second chances. For the first time in years, David Walker let the silence hold him without fear. And in that silence, he found peace. The seasons turned, carrying Pine Ridge from the gold of autumn to the still white of winter, and finally into the soft green of spring. In that time, the town healed in small ways. The name of Alan Carter, once spoken with reverence, was now muttered only in whispers, a grim reminder of betrayal. His trial drew reporters from across the state, but to the people who lived here, what mattered most was not the fall of a false hero, but the survival of the children and the unlikely family that had grown from the ashes. David Walker found his life reshaped by the presence of a boy and a dog. Tommy Harper brought youth into his weary home, his laughter spilling into corners long filled with silence. Rocky patrolled the yard each morning as if the little house were a fortress, his paws pressing purpose into the soil. When Tommy woke from nightmares, Rocky was there before David could even reach the room, a silent guardian easing fear with steady warmth. The townspeople saw the change. At the diner, old men nodded to David, not with pity, but with respect. Parents at the school smiled when Rocky escorted Tommy to the doors, tail wagging proudly. Sheriff Harrison, near retirement, often visited on Sundays, fishing pole in hand, a rare softness easing his stern face. Even Sarah McKenna lingered more often, her auburn hair catching the sun as she watched Tommy toss sticks for Rocky, her freckles bright against a smile that had been rare in her life. David, once haunted by guilt, now felt the weight lift in pieces. He still remembered the girl he had failed, her face etched in memory. But standing beside Tommy and Rocky, he came to believe what Pastor Howard, the gray-haired minister of the town's small church, told him one morning, "Grace doesn't erase scars, son. It turns them into maps, so you know the way home." On a quiet evening, nearly a year after that storm, David, Tommy, and Rocky returned to the lake. The water shimmered under the fading sun, dragonflies skimming its glassy surface. David cast his line with practiced ease, Tommy sitting cross-legged with his own smaller rod, brows furrowed in concentration. Rocky lay between them, ears pricking at every splash, tail tapping the wooden dock like a slow heartbeat. Tommy leaned his head against David's arm, whispering, "Do you think Mom and Dad can see me now?" David swallowed the lump in his throat, his blue eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think they'd be proud, Tommy. I think they'd be glad you've got Rocky to keep watch, and me to teach you how to fish." The boy smiled faintly, reaching down to scratch Rocky's ear. The dog sighed contentedly, closing his eyes. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake in hues of fire and rose. 3 silhouettes stretched across the dock, a man with lines carved deep by loss and redemption, a boy who had endured too much but found hope again, and a dog whose loyalty bridged the gap between despair and grace. It was not the life David had imagined years ago, nor the one he thought he deserved after his failures. It was something quieter, harder won, and perhaps more precious. A miracle not of thunderous light, but of a steady bark in the night, of a boy's trust, and of God's quiet hand, weaving broken pieces into a home. And in that silence, as the stars blinked awake overhead, David finally breathed without the weight of yesterday pressing down. Rocky's presence at his side was proof enough. Some heroes wore badges, some wore scars, and some simply had 4 paws and a heart that never gave up. What if the bark of a dog was not just a warning, but God's whisper, reminding us that hope still lives in the darkest places? David and Rocky proved that one act of loyalty can rescue lives, heal broken hearts, and turn sorrow into new beginnings. And maybe that's the question for all of us tonight. In your own life, when shadows surround you, will you still listen for the voice of hope? May God bless you and your family with peace, love, and protection. And if this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because more stories of faith and courage are on the way.